Lesson 13. Joseph in his youth, faithful under trial. God did send me before you to preserve life. Reading Genesis 37 to 41. Objective. Joseph's life teaches us how we as young people can maintain a good conscience toward God, even when we are under trial. Background. Jacob was blessed with 12 sons and 1 daughter. Only Joseph and Benjamin were the sons of Rachel, his most loved wife. The other sons caused him much heartache and at times caused trouble with the people who lived nearby. Joseph was the most favored of all Jacob's sons. He loved Joseph more than them all, in verse 3. However, his brethren responded with envy to Joseph and could not speak peaceably unto him, in verse 4. When Joseph was 17 years old, the situation worsened. He dreamed 2 dreams and told them to his family. In the first dream, Joseph saw the family reaping in the field. Each person had a sheaf which rose and stood upright. The sheaves of each member of the family bowed down to Joseph's sheaf. In the second dream, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed down to him. Jacob and his sons could see the dreams were prophecies showing Joseph having dominion over the rest of his family. This only served to increase the envy and hatred of his brothers toward him. Jacob, however, observed the saying in verse 11, as he perceived the hand of God in the dreams. There was more to those dreams than Joseph's brethren cared to understand. Joseph sold, Jacob deceived again. Genesis 37 verses 12 to 35. Eventually the envy of Joseph's brothers overtook them. Their plan was to kill him and deceive their father to believe that Joseph was taken by a wild animal. Only Reuben sought to save him, verses 21 to 22. They had no conscience toward Yahweh and their father, so they put him in a pit and then sold their own brother to passing Ishmaelite traders. The deception of their father caused him great sorrow. He believed his beloved son was tragically taken from him and said, I will go down to the grave for my son mourning. Verse 35. Sold into faithful service in Potiphar's house. Genesis 37 verse 36 and Genesis 39 verses 1 to 6. The Ishmaelites or Midianites sold Joseph to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's army. God was with Joseph and caused everything he did to prosper. His master also realized that his own prosperity was caused by Yahweh's hand in blessing Joseph. He made Joseph the overseer of his house, and he gave everything that he had into the trustworthy and honest hands of Joseph. He was in a very prosperous and privileged circumstances. He had control over the house of this important person, and he maintained his faith in God, which helped him to fulfill his duties honorably and well in his new environment. Remember, Joseph was only 17 when he was taken into Egypt. Genesis 39 verses 7 to 20. Potiphar's wife saw Joseph was an attractive young man and sought to seduce him to gratify her fleshly desires. Joseph constantly rejected her as she approached him day after day. His response showed his godly thinking. He said, How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Here was a young man away from the spiritual influence and watchful eye of his parents, in an environment where God's spiritual principles were not understood. Yet Joseph was very aware of God's presence and had an unshakable conscience toward God. So determined was she toward him that one day she took hold of him by his garment to make him obey her. Joseph fled from her, leaving his garment in her hand. Feeling scorned and humiliated by Joseph, Potiphar's wife now retaliated by lying to her husband, who then had Joseph thrown into prison. Basic Bible teaching: the nature of redemption. James 1 verse 14 tells us that every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. The Apostle John in 1 John 2 verse 16 identifies the three lusts which cause our temptation and entice us to sin: the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. We sin when we allow these lusts to lead us away from the principles of truth. In the example of Joseph, Potiphar's wife expected that she could seduce and draw away Joseph by exciting his lust and entice him to sin against God and her husband. However, Joseph's conscience was strong enough to resist the advance of this evil woman. Lust works in a very subtle way that can trap us before we know if we are not aware. We can see something that is appealing, we covet after it because it makes us feel good, and we want it as it will gratify our desires. Let us not fool ourselves, for we are all subject to the same temptations and weaknesses. Conscience must be strong enough in our lives to withstand the enticements of the world around us. They can be anything that will draw us away from God: possessions, entertainment, friendships, conversation, relationships, worldly activities, and behavior can all be the things that we need to be careful of. Like Joseph, we are surrounded by people who do not know the ways of God and therefore do not have a conscience toward God. These people know how to entice us to take part with them in the things which satisfy their lusts. The entire advertising industry is devoted in doing just that. The attraction is in the things which look attractive, the things which we are told or we believe will make us feel good, and the things which appeal to our pride. Now that we know how our human desires work, we need to prepare ourselves to overcome these temptations which surround us every day. Elevated from prison. Elevated from prison. Genesis 39 verse 21 to Genesis 41 verse 36. Even in prison, Joseph's faith did not change. As it happened in Potiphar's house, God blessed Joseph and everything he did was made to prosper. The keeper of the prison trusted Joseph and placed all the prisoners under his care. Whilst Joseph was in prison, Pharaoh's butler and baker were cast into prison, and Joseph was charged with looking after them. Both these men had dreams and wanted the meaning of their dreams explained. Joseph, guided by Yahweh, was able to tell them the meaning of their dreams. The butler would be restored to serving Pharaoh within 3 days, and the baker would be hanged. Joseph told the butler to think of him when he was restored, and to show kindness by mentioning him to the king, so that Joseph too could be brought out of the prison. 2 years later, Pharaoh himself had 2 dreams and was anxious to have them interpreted. Only then did the butler remember Joseph and advertise the king of his own experience with his dream. Joseph was brought out of prison, and he explained to the king that only God could interpret dreams, and went on to tell the king the interpretation. Both the dreams were to teach the same message, and they were to tell the king that Egypt would have 7 years of plenty to be followed by 7 years of famine. Genesis 41 verses 28 to 30. The dreams were repeated to show the king the certainty of the meaning, for the thing was established by God, and God would shortly bring it to pass in verse 32. Not only did Joseph pass on the meaning of the dreams, but he told Pharaoh what he had to do to prepare for the 7 years of famine. He should appoint over his kingdom a wise man who could ensure that corn was put away in store during the 7 years of plenty. In this way, the country would have food for the 7 years of famine. Joseph was 30 years old when he came before Pharaoh, having now been away from his family for 13 years. Verse 46. Joseph rules Egypt. Genesis 41 verses 37 to 57. Pharaoh saw the wisdom of Joseph's advice, and that God was with him. He appointed him as second in charge over his house and kingdom, with authority to rule his people. Verse 39 to 41. In this position of authority, Joseph prepared for the famine to come. During the 7 years of plenty, he made huge stockpiles of corn throughout the land of Egypt, and the 7 years of famine followed as God had said. Joseph was able to sell the corn not only to the people of Egypt, but also to all those in other countries which had been affected by the famine. Principle for living. We can learn much from the example of Joseph about how to overcome temptation. Temptation is something we need to deal with every day of our life. Only by faith can we overcome temptation. 1 John 5 verse 4. Joseph fled from the grasp of Potiphar's wife to avoid a situation which could only end with disastrous consequences. In speaking to the young man Timothy, Paul said, "Flee also youthful lusts." 2 Timothy 2 verse 22. Paul is exhorting Timothy to do what Joseph did. What Paul means when he says to flee youthful lusts is to get away from the scene where we are likely to have our lusts excited and the principles of the truth compromised. He is telling us to stay away from the things, the places, the activities which might cause us to give in to the temptations of the world. Not just to stay away, but to flee, or to run away from such things. To the Corinthians he also gave 2 specific pieces of advice. Flee fornication, 1 Corinthians 6 verse 18, and flee from idolatry, 1 Corinthians 10 verse 14. As a positive action, we need to strengthen our conscience by knowing and believing the Word of God and His laws. Summary. Joseph was much loved by his father and developed a spirituality and conscience toward God which his brethren did not appreciate. They were motivated by envy to harm him and sold him into Egypt. God blessed Joseph in Egypt, and despite the difficulties, God raised him up to be ruler over Egypt. Joseph's conscience caused him to flee from temptation and remain faithful to God in times of trial. He is an excellent example to us of how to overcome the trials we face.